Hello, and welcome to Northfield Medical's Using the Preventable Damage to Flexible Endoscope Audit Form. My name is Michael Matthews, and I'm the Director of Education and Training for Northfield Medical. Today, we're going to explain the need for the auditing process. We're going to identify common sources of preventable damage to flexible endoscopes. We're going to describe best practices for preventing that damage to flexible endoscopes. We're going to suggest a specific strategy for developing an ongoing quality improvement program to help prevent that damage and then lower your repair costs. First off, let's talk about auditing. The Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, or AAMI, suggests in Chapter 14, which is all about process improvement, that performance measures for problem investigation should include, and it lists several things, but one of the things that it specifically includes is instrument and equipment damage or failure. Now, the reason for this is that we should always be seeking to make our processes better for both our patients and for the facility's bottom line. A proper process improvement project is very intentional. You have to really seek out what are the problems and how best to fix them. If you aren't very intentional with that, you turn into what a lot of managers have to deal with, which is running around and feeling like you're putting out fires all day long. The solution for this is to be intentional about identifying problems and then identifying those solutions for them and documenting them. This is all accomplished through an auditing process. And again, we want to keep in mind the bottom line. The average cost for a flexible scope repair is $2,000. Now, obviously, there are some repairs that are significantly less than that, but there's also a lot of repairs that are significantly higher than that. So when you average them all out, they come out to around $2,000. And these scopes break regularly. This is a constant source of headache for those who are working on the front lines. Now, because of the importance of auditing and because of the value that it can bring to you, Northfield Medical has designed audit forms that you can use to help evaluate your process and identify where those sources of preventable damage are occurring. And those audit forms are available for free upon request. We designed the audit forms to follow a single device through one cycle of its life. Therefore, you'll want to have one audit form for each time the device is used, and you'll want to follow it throughout its entire process. We're going to start in the OR setup. First, we want the device to be visually inspected and function tested prior to the physician and the patient entering the room. Now, some simple tests that can be performed are the angulation system, and we want to look for those early signs of damage. And again, we're talking about play in the knobs, which means that when you turn the knob, the distal tip isn't quite as responsive as it needs to be. And that's a problem that physicians deal with very frequently. And so if you notice that this device has some play in the knobs, maybe it's not too bad, but it is there, that's something that you'll definitely want to make note of. And you're also looking for signs of things like buckling. And again, these are very obvious things that you can kind of do a quick visual check of in that time where the room is being set up, but the physician and the patient haven't come into the room yet. Now, keep in mind, our goal as reprocessing professionals should always be to find problems before they make it to the surgeon and the patient, because at that point, it's too late. We don't want the system to be reactive, meaning that the surgeon gets angry because the device is not working properly, or because the patient is now having to spend more time under anesthesia while you go get another device. We want to take care of all of these problems prior to that. So anything that we can do before we get to that position in the room is very important. Next, we're going to observe the procedure itself. We're going to be looking for any sort of functionality or performance issues that are noted during the procedure, and these are usually things that the physician themselves will note. We're also looking for improper use or handling. Now, keep in mind that physicians may be mishandling the device and causing damage and may not be aware of it. Typically, proper handling and care of the devices themselves are not taught in most med schools, so they may have developed some bad habits that they're simply not aware of, such as, for example, over-torquing those knobs, twisting them too hard, for example, or sometimes we've seen physicians sort of rest the control body of the device on the bed, which causes this really sharp angle for that insertion tube, and that will really stretch out the angulation system and that biopsy channel. So anytime you're seeing a physician do these things, that's when you want to make a note of it. And this, one of the reasons why this audit form is so helpful is because you don't typically want to try to address that while the physician is working on a patient. That's just not the proper time to bring something like that up. However, you can mark it on your audit form, and then that way you have it documented, and you can go into that physician potentially afterwards and say, hey, we observed some of your cases. We saw some mishandling in this number of cases. This seems to be a regular issue. Or if by chance maybe you don't want to have that conversation with the physician, that's something that you can elevate to your administrators so that they can have that conversation. Next, we're going to move into the pre-cleaning process. Now, it's very critical that the pre-cleaning process be initiated immediately following the procedure. Some of the bodily fluids that we have to deal with, like mucus, for example, will harden very quickly. And so if pre-cleaning is not done every single time as quickly as possible, that mucus will harden. And when it hardens in certain areas, like the air-water channel, for example, it's very easy for those channels to get clogged. And when they get clogged, there's nothing else you can do for them. They're going to have to go out for repair. And so the specific steps that a scope has to go through for pre-cleaning will be lined out for you in those manufacturer's IFUs. So make sure that you know them. Some general rules that are pretty universal for all devices, though, is that the exterior gets wiped with a lint-free cloth. And then especially in Olympus devices, you're going to want to make sure that you're using the high-pressure buttons to aspirate those channels immediately following the procedures. That high-pressure button is designed specifically for cleaning, and it increases the amount of pressure that's pulled through and pushed through that device in order to help facilitate that cleaning process. And so typically that's 30 seconds of water, 10 seconds of air. Again, that will be outlined in your IFUs. Next, we're going to want to make sure that the angulation locks are being released and that the tensioner is in the most free position. If this is not done at this point, then anytime the scope gets moved, it's kind of grinding against those locks. It's very similar to trying to drive your car with the parking brake on. And of course, yes, if you press the gas hard enough, your car will go, but what it ends up doing is ends up burning up the parking brake in the process. And something very similar can happen that, if you have a physician that makes use of those locks and the tensioner, and you try to go through all your reprocessing steps with those locks and with that tensioner still in place, it will end up really using up your angulation system. Now, one of the most common sources of preventable damage happens during the transportation phase. We want to make sure that the scope is being transported properly in a solid bottom container that is the right size so that you do not have to coil the scope too tightly and that you don't kink it. And one of the most common mistakes we see is having more than one scope put into a single container. This happens a lot, especially when you're doing a double procedure such as an upper and a lower, and you end up just putting both scopes into the container because that seems more efficient, right? You have one container to move. But what happens is that the scope ends up crushing the other scope, and these things are so delicate that it's incredibly easy for any sort of extra weight to do damage. And it's very important to keep in mind that certain transportation methods, while they may work from an infection control standpoint, such as the bag that you see on top, again, from an infection prevention standpoint, that's perfectly acceptable. But if we're talking about preventing damage, anything that doesn't support the scope properly or allows it to move around freely, get bumped, jostled, bang into itself, anything like that is going to potentially cause a lot of damage. Next, we'll move into the decontamination phase. First, we want to test that leak tester to make sure that it's actually functioning correctly. If your leak tester isn't working, then you're not going to find any leaks, regardless of whether or not there are any. So it's very important to make sure that your testing materials are actually being tested themselves every single time. And we want to make sure that a proper leak test is performed. And again, the specific instructions for this will be outlined in your manufacturer's IFUs. But again, generally speaking, we want to see that the leak tester is attached and detached from the scope while dry, not underwater. We want to see at least 30 seconds of observation underwater. We want to see those knobs and those switches being manipulated, turning those angulation knobs. This is another great time to kind of check that angulation system to make sure that it's working properly. And after we're done with that leak test, we want to make sure that we depressurize or burp that scope. Leak testing is so critical from a cost-saving standpoint because fluid invasion really is one of the most expensive types of damage, and it's almost entirely preventable. You can see from these pictures some of the damage that's done by fluid, and you can see corrosion. The bottom picture has the CCD chip that was completely destroyed by fluid, and the result of that is a lot of expensive damage to that device, and it takes a really long time to get repaired. Next, during the decontamination phase, we want to inspect that distal tip for damage to the C cover and the lights. We want to make sure that enzymatic is being dispensed into the sink water according to the IFUs. We very often see technicians putting too much enzymatic into the sink because the assumption is that more detergent will make it more clean, right? And that's just simply not true. It actually tends to inhibit the cleaning process, especially when we come to the high-level disinfection. And then we also want to make sure that the scope is handled delicately during the manual cleaning process. So not dropping into the sink, not hitting it against the sink side, no kinking. But this really highlights the importance of auditing and visual observation, because while I think every technician would say, of course I don't drop my scope into the sink, of course we don't hit it against the sink side, most of the time when these things are happening, it's when you're in a hurry and it's very accidental and you're so focused on maybe what the next step is that you just don't simply notice that you hit it against the sink side, or maybe you put it into the sink a little aggressively. And so these are things that don't come up unless you have somebody kind of from a neutral standpoint just observing. And it's also very important that you use visual and lighted magnification, especially when you're looking at that distal tip. We're talking about openings and damage that is so small and so subtle that you just simply cannot be observed by the naked eye. Now, when we come to the high-level disinfection phase, we want to make sure that the scope is being handled correctly while it's being loaded into that automatic endoscope reprocessor. Now, keep in mind to follow the manufacturer of your AER's IFUs for how to properly load a scope. We also want to make sure that the proper chemicals are in use, again defined by that manufacturer's IFUs. And we want to make sure that the scope that you're processing is approved for those specific high-level disinfection or sterilization methods. Again, that will be defined by your IFUs. Again, one thing that we want to keep in mind is regardless of which process you're using or which manufacturer you're using, you want to use certain care and handling methods while you're loading the scope and while you're unloading the scope. And one of the most common mistakes that we see people making is trying to hold the scope with one hand. Now, this is important because how a department is designed will help or hinder a technician's ability to follow this instruction. So, for example, if your department has a doorway between the dirty side and the clean side that has to be pulled open, it's very likely that your technicians are carrying the scopes with one hand because they have to have a free hand to open the other door. And so, very basic design features or flaws in your department will either help facilitate or hinder your ability to handle the scopes properly. And identifying those problems will help you identify ways to fix them. Now, if you are sterilizing your scopes, for example, a cystoscope or your reader scope or some bronchoscopes, it's very important to make sure that that ETO pressure cap is being used. We also need to make sure that the container securely holds the scope but without coiling it too tightly. And this is when it's really important to make sure that you have a container that has been designed specifically to hold the scope that you are sterilizing. Very often, if you're just forced to make something work, it's not designed properly, and so it doesn't hold the scope properly, so it's rattling around, or maybe it's too small and it ends up having to bend the scope in a way that it's not really designed to in order to just make it fit. And that's where a lot of damage can occur. And you can see the kind of damage that can occur to a small diameter scope if you forget to put that cap on there, so it's very important. Now, after the scope has been high-level disinfected or sterilized, we need to think about its storage. Again, we want to make sure that the scope can be transported from the AER to the storage area while holding the scope with two hands. Those are those design controls that we talked about earlier. And we want to make sure that the scope is being hung in its most free position. Now, if you see any sort of curling or snaking in that insertion tube, that's a sign that that angulation system may need to go out for repair. If you hang a scope with the tensioner in place as well, your scopes will start to look exactly like this. So pay attention to the way your scopes look whenever they're hanging. Now, also in the storage phase, we want to make sure that the amount of storage is adequate for the number of scopes. Now, what that means is that scopes can be placed in or removed from the storage without banging into the other scopes. A corollary to that is that the scope is being delicately placed into the storage cabinet. Again, I think that every technician would say, of course, I'd put it delicately into the cabinet, but one person's definition of gently or delicately may be different than someone else's. And so this is, again, why it's so important to have a neutral observer following these scopes around so that they can identify that maybe what this person calls delicate isn't really all that delicate. And so this provides those good opportunities to have those conversations. And a very key piece to this is just simply the information. So did you know, for example, that this light guide connector that is hanging on every single scope weighs as much as an ortho mallet? And I think that everybody would be very upset if someone walked into their storage cabinet and started swinging around an ortho mallet. Yet I've seen many, many times where technicians place the scopes into the storage cabinets with no regard of how that light guide connector is swinging around. It's the exact same thing. So be very mindful of where these things are hitting as they're being placed in and out of those storage devices. Now, one key piece of preventing damage is something that gets overlooked by administrators very frequently, and that's ensuring that there's an adequate number of scopes for the number of procedures that are being performed. Flexible endoscopes are expensive, and so sometimes administrators will try to get by on as few as possible. And we see this coming up very frequently. In fact, there was a survey conducted by Ofsted and Associates in Isham that found that 70% of reprocessing technicians feel that they are under pressure to go faster when they are reprocessing scopes. Now, keep in mind that properly reprocessing a scope has about 130 steps. And generally speaking, human performance metrics indicate that if a process is really well understood and well trained, you're going to make a mistake about 1 out of every 100 opportunities. However, if you add stress into that mix, that incidence of mistakes goes up from 1 in 100 to 1 in 10. So that means that generally speaking, if there's no pressure on a technician, they might make one mistake in the entire 130 steps of reprocessing. But again, 70% feel that they're under pressure, probably because, among other things, they don't have enough scopes. And so when you add stress to that, they're now making as many as 10 or more errors during that reprocessing phase. Again, nobody is intentionally doing these things. It's just natural that that stress causes us to hurry, and when we hurry, we tend to make more mistakes. Having too few scopes can absolutely result in having more preventable damage occur. Now that we've gone through how to use the form, let's talk about how to start a process improvement project. The first step is to figure out what your baseline is, which means how much are you currently spending on flexible scope repair. So talk to your repair company to get that number. Next, we want to think about how many procedures we are performing in an average day or week that use these flexible scopes. Now, if you're at a very busy facility, you'll probably want to think about it in terms of number of procedures per day. If you're at an average size facility or a smaller facility, it might be easier to think about it in terms of per week. And then next, you want to determine how many audits need to be performed in order to get a good representative sample. And I think that most of the people, when they think about doing this, you're thinking about how few can I do and still get the results I want. But it's very important to remember that the more audits you do, the better information that you're going to get. More audits lead to better results. And we're going to suggest the Six Sigma method for determining how to approach this. And I want to emphasize this is a very simplified version of Six Sigma, but in general, Six Sigma principles are designed to monitor the process in order to determine how many defective processes may occur. So if you think about the reprocessing a scope, you think about what a perfect process would look like, meaning nobody made any mistakes at any point throughout it. And we want to determine how many times this process is defective, meaning there's a mistake being made. So, for example, if we audit this and determine that out of every 10 procedures, 3 of them have a care and handling failure, you have a 30% defect rate. And I would suggest that probably for the most part, we're going to see significantly higher numbers than that. Now, as you accumulate your audits, you're going to want to evaluate where the areas that are the most common areas of failure are, and then create targeted solutions for those. Now, it's very possible that you may identify a dozen different areas of failure, and it's very difficult to try and focus on all of them at the same time. So what you want to do is look at a couple that you have the most likelihood of being able to create a solution, you have the most control over, and has the highest potential for financial savings. And when you find those things that really satisfy those 3 criteria, you know that those are the areas that you really want to focus on before moving on to maybe some of the others. And then you'll want to create targeted solutions for those, which means the solution has to be specific to the problem. And it may be as simple as having an in-service, or it may be something as complex as changing the design of your department, maybe putting extra padding in your sink, or changing the way that your door is facing between the dirty side and the clean side. And it's always important to test your solutions in order to make sure that they're working, and then measure your progress. This makes an excellent opportunity to really promote your department and your successes to your administrators. So let's work through an example. Let's say last year your spend on flexible endoscopes, which that's that baseline that we talked about, was $100,000. Now, regular care and maintenance is around 20% typically, so we'll say that's $20,000, which is just normal. It's not a problem with the process. It's just normal use requires this. This is kind of like rotating the tires on your car or changing the oil. So we know that we have about $80,000 in savings opportunities. So we do our audit, and the audit reveals that we've got about a 50% failure rate, and that's our baseline failure. Now, after our improvement efforts, after we've looked at the audits and after we've identified what those things are that we can fix, and we've come up with targeted solutions, we've tested them, we've put them into place, and now we're re-auditing again, we found that our new failure rate is 30%. And right here, I want to emphasize you're probably never going to get to 0, so keep that in mind. But we've made a 20% improvement rate. Now, what does that mean financially? Well, if we have a 50% failure rate, and 50% failure rate results in $80,000 of preventable cost, then we should be able to assume that a 30% failure rate is probably going to result in $48,000 of preventable cost. That's an improvement of $32,000. Big difference from such a small improvement. So keep that in mind. Minor improvements can still lead to a lot of money. In fact, let's think about it. What can you do with $32,000? Well, you can buy 5 more small diameter flexible scopes. You could buy 2 large diameter flexible scopes. You could buy 21 rigid laparoscopes. You could buy 13 surgical power tools, 10 video cameras, or if you want to have a great pizza party, you could buy 5,342 Little Caesars hot and ready pizzas, and that does not include the tip. Now keep in mind that all of these prices are based on certified pre-owned equipment. Little improvements can lead to a lot bigger results. So in conclusion, keep in mind, most damage to devices occurs as part of its use in procedures and the reprocessing cycle. Very rarely do we have anybody that's intentionally damaging devices. Most of the time, it's lack of information or bad procedures that are put in place. Regular auditing can be an important tool that helps identify where that damage is occurring to the devices. And these process improvement projects have demonstrable return on investments. And that ROI that we talk about, That's what administrators really love to hear about and hear to see. So this is a great time to really build up your department in the eyes of your administration and get some of that equipment that you desperately need. Because the money saved on preventable damage can be reinvested into a number of valuable improvements for your department. Thank you.